Yeah. Thank you so much for joining. Test, test. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. We're going to get started in a moment, so please find your seats, and thank you so much for your patience. Awesome. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Fadi Khaf'aiti, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Jerusalem Fund and Palestine Center. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here today to welcome you for this film screening and discussion with Professor Shourideh Molavi, who's the lead Palestine researcher at Forensic Architecture. As difficult as these screenings and conversations are today, I wish to start off on a short positive note before an uplifting one before we begin, because this is a special event for us in many ways. Firstly, it's special because we resume our long-standing traditions of collaborating and co-sponsoring with our neighboring institutions and organizations in DC. And I wanted to give a special thank you for the Institute for Palestine Studies for agreeing to co-sponsor with us, for actually bringing this event to us for co-sponsorship. And we hope that this will be many, many, many more collaborations to come. I also wish to give special thanks to our board of directors who are all joining us here virtually. At the Jerusalem Fund, Dr. Subhi Ali, Dr. Eid Mustafa, and Dr. Muhayya Khilfe, and at the IPS USA board, Rashid Khalidi, Nadia Abul Hajj, and Philip Matar. This event, as I said, is the start of many fruitful collaborations, and the next one we'll be having with the Institute for Palestine Studies will be on Tuesday, March 18th, when we have a book launch discussion of Professor Brian Barber's No Way But Forward. And secondly, perhaps even more importantly, there's a special event for both myself and the organization, as we want to recognize and welcome back a dear friend of the Jerusalem Fund, Jihad Abu Salim, who's now my predecessor and who's now the executive director at the Institute for Palestine Studies. Jihad needs no introduction for anyone who is involved in Palestine solidarity work, both in DC and in the United States and beyond. But I nonetheless want to acknowledge him and for all his support and advice as I've been easing into this new role. So we're joined here in person and both online for a film screening and discussion of executions and mass graves in Tantura and al-Dawayima in 1948. Dr. Molavi will begin with a presentation and brief discussion around the research and analysis that went into the production of the investigative documentaries. We'll then screen both films with a brief intermission, followed by a Q&A, a discussion before we move to Q&A. Based in London, the research group Forensic Architecture emerged as a critical practice dedicated to challenging settler colonial violence in Palestine with locally situated counter-investigations. Its work has expanded globally to offer groundbreaking investigations into state, corporate, and colonial crimes. For the past 3 years, Forensic Architecture has launched a series of investigative projects analyzing the available visual and cartographic evidence of Zionist and Israeli massacres of Palestinians in and around the Nakba of 1948. Focusing on continuities in Palestine's ongoing Nakba and its history of settler colonialism, forensic architecture researchers have worked closely with Palestinian witnesses to and living survivors of these massacres using immersive architectural modeling as a tool of recollection to reconstruct their lost life worlds and uncover new evidence of Israeli crimes. Screened for the first time in the United States, FA's two investigative projects into massacres conducted by Zionist paramilitary groups, as well as Israeli forces, and the mass graves constructed after the forced depopulations in the Palestinian villages of Tantura and al-Dawayima, two among hundreds of villages erased from the landscape in 1948, will be shown and followed by an immersive lecture. In the context of Israel's genocidal campaign in the occupied Gaza Strip, these investigative projects speak to longer colonial practices seeking to systematically destroy Palestinian life and environment, bodies, and architecture. So now I introduce you to Professor Shourideh Molavi. Dr. Molavi is the lead Palestine researcher for forensic architecture, linking their investigations to the work and research of civil society, grassroots groups, and human rights defenders in the country. She has worked in Palestine for over 20 years and in Gaza specifically for the past decade. She's also a senior lecturer at the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University in New York City and has a background in political science and international humanitarian law. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Molavi onto the stage.
Take a minute to set it up again. We were joking about what would happen to the laptop. Oh. There we go. Let me set this up. No, it's okay. I'm happy to go analog with this. You see, there we go. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming on a Saturday. Thank you to those who are joining us remotely. I'm Shourideh Molavi. As was mentioned, I'm the dedicated Palestine researcher at Forensic Architecture. I'm very happy to be with you today. It's maybe my second time in Washington, and the moment you come out of the train, you feel empire. It just boom, it hits you with the columns and the flags and the police and this like civilizational architecture. And so coming here felt really good, seeing all your faces, but it feels like a safe space. I have to say, a space where you can detox. Thank you for having me. Thank you to the Institute for Palestine Studies for hosting this talk, and also for the Jerusalem Fund for doing so. It is the first time that we're showing both investigations in the United States. They're investigations that we completed in May 2023, the Tantura film, on the anniversary, the 75th anniversary of the depopulation of the village. And then after October of 2023, of course, everybody's priorities changed. And we continued, despite this, in 2024, looking into the village of Dawayima. I thought that before I would start going into those two investigations, I would give you a sense of what we do at Forensic Architecture. So I'm not an architect, and I have to say we have very few architects in our office. We have developers and modelers and theorists and researchers, few architects here and there, environmental scientists we work with, etc., depending on our projects. And so you can imagine a room of people coming from various disciplines, different parts of the world, trying to tackle a single question. And that question almost always revolves around state or corporate violence somewhere in the world. Our work started in Palestine. What we learned in Palestine, we apply to other contexts that are colonial, military, occupation, etc., contexts around the world. And what we do is use visual and spatial techniques for investigating these. And so what happens when an interactive platform speaks with living survivors, speaks with archival images, speaks with film and literature and environmental sciences, right? That's what our projects are composed of. This project that I'd like to start with, because I think it's a good example of the kind of work we do. This is the first project I did with Forensic Architecture 10 years ago in the 2014 military onslaught in Gaza. And it was a project that looked at a strike in Rafah on August the 1st. And it was the first project where I got to understand what to do when you have an abundance of images and videos and abundance of data, but not enough knowledge, right? You have a lot of data and you're not really sure of whether these data sets are covering the same event or not. So for example, like this, you have footages, videos that are posted. Are they covering the same event? Are they not? How do they correlate? How can you use them to tell a story? And in this war, in this onslaught, similar to what we've seen in Gaza, since it's been mainly Palestinians documenting their own, civilians on the ground documenting their own massacres, We were approached by Amnesty International on this for this project to document an attack Israel conducted on August 1st. As I mentioned, it was the deadliest day for civilians. Over 135 Palestinians in Gaza were killed in the al-Tanur neighborhood in Rafah. And so the question was, what happened, right? Who broke the ceasefire, of course, but also what kind of weapons were used, where were they dropped? This was an attack concurrent with the capture of an Israeli soldier by the resistance fighters in Gaza. And so what Israel did was that it implemented, as it has since, the Hannibal Doctrine and flattened the neighborhood, right? As part of this investigation, I spoke to Israeli political theorists, we can say military analysts, also Asa Kasher, one of the few people who's actually read the Hannibal protocols. And what he told me was that the protocol it doesn't allow the army to kill the soldier directly, but allows them to do other things that will kill the soldier. And in this case, it meant flattening the city on top of the heads of the people, which is why it was the deadliest day. So what we had to work with were the images that people released. We were not given access to the ground, like most times journalists were banned access, entry, etc. And so to tell that story, we verified and located the videos that we collected. We put them along a timeline. And here too, we developed, and these are teams of people working on these in the office, developed techniques using simple architectural techniques to locate from where the videos were taken. So here with triangulation, you're able to determine from where the observer is standing. I don't know if you see my mouse, yeah. When they're filming it, filming a scene, and when you understand where they're standing, you can do a number of other things. You can understand from where the projectiles arrived. You can understand then time and location, which means you can put it on a timeline alongside other instances. And that allows you to then tell a story that actually, even though you have tons of data sets, a lot of them are documenting the same incident from different perspectives. And this, of course, changes once you put these data sets within a 3D model that then allow you to spatialize the areas that are impacted, where people were standing, etc. One technique that was developed out of this that we still use is an analysis of plumes, where you analyze the shape of the smoke dust that comes out after every explosion. Of course, each cloud that you see after a bombing has a unique signature because it's composed of the material, the matter, the human beings, the vegetation that was stricken, that was hit. And so it has a unique signature. And if you model that cloud and you see in other images where you can find it, you understand that they're actually documenting the same incident. But what we managed to do in this project was, and you kind of have this moment where you capture the missile just before it arrives. And this was significant for us because in this moment, because we had the screen, we knew the position from where it was being filmed. We were then able to model it and measure it, present a kind of grid from the perspective of the viewer. In presenting it as a grid, it allowed us to measure the missile, its width and its height, and then going on public public open source data that's available, you understand that this is a 1-ton bomb being dropped in a densely populated residential area on August the 1st, 2014. Now, in December of 2023, 2 months into this iteration of the genocide in Gaza, the New York Times had documented at least 200 of these 1-ton bombs being dropped in Gaza. So you understand that in the past 10 years, how much the accepted level of violence has increased, how much the dehumanization has been exponentially widened and made so much more present, the damage of which has been made much more present on people's bodies. So while we spent a good chunk of time examining this one strike, we're now in a situation where at least 200 of these strikes were in Gaza in the first 2 months of this genocide. So it's an example of the kind of work we do, the techniques that we use. Simple architectural tools. We use a lot of open source materials. When I started work at Forensic Architecture, my aim was to make sure that the work we do speaks to what people want on the ground. It speaks to the work of civil society on the ground. So we do not take on a project unless we have Palestinian partners on the ground that are collaborating with us on these projects, people who are witnessing it firsthand, and importantly, can activate the project after, in various ways, through talks, citizen tribunals, marches, exhibitions, etc. Today, we're going to be looking at two projects that if they felt significant when we started them, feel urgent now. They're a part of a larger set of historical projects that we're doing at Forensic Architecture, where we're building a cartography of Palestine by looking at massacres and mass graves from 1947 to 1949. And here, of course, we understand the Nakba as a historical period, but also as a process, as a strategy that's ongoing and that has today become more technologized, surveilled, fortified, militarized in all of the ways that I think everybody here is aware of. These are two projects that I led, each with a different team at Forensic Architecture, and with different sets of collaborations with Palestinian historians, filmmakers, survivors and their descendants from these two villages, whom we interviewed, and researchers, of course. And I think what's really important for our work is to think about images, right? These are images from the Benno Rothenberg collection in a folder titled Tantura, right? And when we look at this image, we're looking at the facial expression of the person, of the photographer, trying to focus on what he's documenting. And what you're seeing in the background is the Nakba, right? Is people fleeing with their belongings. Mainly, you're seeing women and children. You see also elderly, right? So then the question is, where are the men? What happened to the men? And when I'm looking at these collections now, 15, 16 months after this iteration of the genocide in Gaza, they mean something different to us, right? You understand the historical continuity. And for us at Forensic Architecture, images is really our bread and butter. Now also sound, we're working a lot with sound, but for us, the question is how to decode them, how to read them. And so images like this, you can think of the contemporary iterations of an image like this, right? A photographer standing by while vessels of humanitarian aid are passing, while people who are displaced are fleeing. So these images, even though they're 80, say, years old, almost are going to trigger us because of what we're seeing today. So they speak very much to our present. And in that sense, Gaza is both the past and the present, but it's also the future. It's the future direction of where we are seeing genocidal warfare and warfare in general going. I'm just going to slide through these. You also see moments where they're taking the testimonies of people who have just fled their villages, where medical workers are treating the wounded and being documented as such. Giving them water, food that was denied. And then you also see images of perpetrators posing, which is interesting because of what we're seeing now, right? Longer histories of perpetrators posing in front of homes and villages on lands that they've occupied. And then you have images of the violations happening midway, right? Because what we don't have from 48 is literally an image of someone being shot, or literally an image of a house being blown up. We have the before and after, but at that time there was, we didn't have videos, we don't have Instagram, none of the social media. We had photos, right? And so here you see women and children, the process of separation. Here you see men being led, only men. So the women and children have already been separated. We know from the stones that they're being led across a cemetery in Tantura. And here you see the women and children mainly being rounded up, right? So it's the before and after. And what's important is that when you deal with witnesses, and the witnesses fill in, they tell you what happened after the men and women were separated. They tell you what happened after the men were marched in groups of 8 to 10 and never to return. So you started to read and decode these images differently. And for us, we know that massacres occurred in 1947 to 49. Historians have documented this. The more we looked into it, we realized, along with historians, that the question of where are the bodies buried wasn't one that was asked. Massacres occurred, but what happened to the bodies? Where are the bodies buried? And if the bodies are buried somewhere, then that land, that earth, is sacred. So this was the strategy that was presented to us by Adala, which is a legal center located in Haifa. It's Palestinian-led. And this was presented to us in 2020, so during COVID for the first time, that they wanted our support in decoding images like this, in trying to understand, geolocate the site of a mass grave that was well known and admitted to both by Zionist perpetrators and by Palestinian survivors, that there's a mass grave that exists in a field near the cacti bushes, surrounded by 3 palm trees opposite the cemetery. Right? So they asked us, find it, mark its boundaries, and the strategy would be to go to an Israeli court, not to say Zionist perpetrators, not to say, you can't say in an Israeli court, Nakba, or colonial violence. But what you can say is there are bodies here, and therefore this land is sacred, and it needs to be marked off. And that was the strategy, which is itself radical, right? Which is itself saying sometime between 1947 and 49, masses were killed and they were buried here. Everybody knows what we are talking about. So we started by looking at aerial images and trying to read these aerial images in a different way. We looked at the aerial images from before 1948, May 23rd, 1948, when Tantura was invaded and forcefully depopulated. So here we have a 1945 image. And we looked at images after 1949. These are aerial photos that the British took in 45 and the Israeli Air Force took in 49, right? So you have the image before and the image after, not satellites, right? They're from the air. And then when you start to read, as our colleagues did in the office, which buildings are missing, which roads are missing, right? Really granular. We spend months on a single image looking at the differences. You begin to mark, right? And we have even more granular images than this. And when you mark, you understand also the direction of how they entered the village, right? Which was very similar in almost all the cases. They entered from 3 directions, pushing people out of the 4th. Right? The idea was to displace. So when you mark the roads and the paths that appear to have been created in 49, you understand the direction from which they entered, and you realize how nicely it aligns with what people remember, right? That the Zionist paramilitary forces came from 3 directions, they would tell us. And here the land remembers also, as the people do. But again, our observation was on this one potential site. Here, Earthwork 1, as we called it. This is the image from 1946. In 1947, it's still there. Suddenly, in 1949, something changes, right? You have a scar that didn't exist before, which is here, very visible from the sky. Also, you have the building of a road and a building, and it took us a lot of months of investigation of who built this building, who made this road, a question that we still haven't answered. But it became very clear that here you have a scar on the earth, right? This is a site that's opposite the cemetery, which is up here. It's surrounded by cacti bushes. There are 3 large palm trees that are visible. It corresponds, right? And then you start to mark the land. You start to mark the before and after to notice other changes that have occurred in that field between the 2 years. And eventually you start to mark, based on the shadows and modeling those shadows, where the bodies would have been, so you can give precise latitude and longitude of the perimeters of this grave. You measure the height of the mound so that you can then determine approximately how many bodies would have fit in there, depending on how they were laid. And this helps, of course, when you model it in 3D. And then you look at, of course, the measurements of if you have the cacti tree here and the person is standing, there's 5-meter distance, and then you have a mound that's approximately 1 meter long. And so an image like this begins to tell you something else, because here people were rounded up after the invasion and occupation of the village that happened on the night of May 22nd to the morning of May 23rd, which means that many of those massacres had occurred during the invasion occupation and were about to occur. But what's behind them are cacti, which means that the grave that we marked is behind the cacti. Right? So this image tells us something else. This is the closest image we have of the mass grave. And in measuring the shadows in this image, you're then able to tell how high are the cacti trees to then compare that to the shadows that you measured in the aerial image that I showed you previously. Of course, when once the village is depopulated, you also see other scars where you see what went from a village that was used, where the gardens were tended and the roofs were intact. By 1952, the roofs already have holes in them. They are falling in. They're not tended. Gardens aren't tended. And the scar of the grave still remains. By 1957, the area is flattened, which means that if there are human remains, those human remains are also spread, which opens our area of sacred land, sacred terrain. And in the present, that area is now a parking lot for a tourist resort that's actively used on what Tantura was. So this is where we were able to arrive from the historical images that we had. But of course, each of those people who fled, right, and who were pushed out, each of them have memories of what happened on that day that isn't captured by these aerial footages. And when you started to listen to what people were saying, of course, they were talking about the mass grave that existed opposite the cemetery, but they were telling us about other mass graves that existed, right? And there was one other major one that repeatedly I would hear when I was listening to the testimonies, which is the Dasuri field, Bustan al-Dasuri, the Dasuri orchard. The Dasuri family's orchard, there was another grave. And of course, it's difficult to know where did the Dasuri family live. We didn't have a full map of the village of Tantura with all of the family names, etc. At the time, until we started to look at other sources. And so when people ask me, what is the most important source that you had in terms of the most important map, this is the map that I showed them. This is a memory map that was a sketch that was made by a survivor from Tantura, Ahmed Taha Salam. It's actually on Palestine Remembered. And he identifies, of course, it's very geometric. I mean, each house is a box. The streets are more clear than usual. It's not proportional like any other map, you could say. But he, importantly, the most important thing that he does is give us property allocations. The numbers that you see on this map correspond to families, right? And shops and meeting areas. And so when you go through this map and you look for the Suri family, you find a number of plots. One of those plots, plot number 6, corresponds to a field, right? And if we think, okay, well, if they buried the bodies in a field in the north of the village, and everybody's telling us it's in another field, likely it's here. And so we went and we looked in a very primitive way. I mean, this is not, you don't need to be high tech to do this, right? From 1947, you look at this second field in the south of the village. And in 1949, you see a small shadow. And that's there. And which is marked, basically. And when you zoom in, you begin to see that there is a darkness here, which means a darkness that didn't exist before, a darkness that we measured, a darkness that we sketched, and a darkness that we modeled. And you realize, again, a method of operation, that this, very similar to the first grave, has an east-west orientation. It's rectangular in shape. It has a 1 meter, approximately 1 meter height, very similar, and it's behind cacti. So cacti also as a way to hide, right, to cover. And when you look at the outline of the village as a whole, you see that the first grave and the second grave are in the periphery of the village, because of course the village was settled very quickly after, and the bodies were decomposing. And so you bury the bodies in the periphery of the village. You don't bury them in the middle if you're a settler living off of the harvest of that year, as they did. In this project whose film you're about to see, we also relied on other mediums. We relied on film. Arab Lutfi's Over the Dead Bodies, a famous film that was made by, I think, one of the few films made by an Arab director, Egyptian director, filmmaker. We also relied on Alon Schwartz's film, Tantura. And the testimonies that they collected were in those films, people would point to where in the cemetery things occur. People who no longer had access to Tantura would point to images of the cemetery that were collected. And so we geolocated or tried to geolocate the areas to which they were pointing and then looked at the maps to see if they corresponded. And so by the end of it, we found 2 very likely mass graves, what we believe are mass graves, of course, the one in the south, Bustan al-Dusughi, and the one in the parking lot, but also other ones, graves that were in the cemetery, where people were buried in the cemetery among individual graves, graves by the beach, by the Yahya house that still remains. And the main witness that we interviewed, Adnan al-Yahya, living survivor of Tantura, lives now in Germany. That is his family home. His home is actually was opposite of it, but this was his uncle's home. So when we did this project, we learned a lot. We learned a lot about how to use images, how to have images speak to testimony. We also learned about a method of operation of where these graves are buried. And I thought, okay, we're going into Dawayima. I know what to look for. Open fields, look for cacti. That's where I'm going to, that's the first place that I'm going to look when I'm looking at mass graves. But as it would happen, Dawayima is a very different village than Tantura, which is obvious. Tantura is much wealthier, much more urbanized. Dawayima is much more of a pastoral village, where people, even identifying their surroundings, would refer to rivers and the type of soil and the threshing floor and wells and kilns. These were the markers. It wasn't so much the butcher's home, the school, etc. And so when you have a village that is largely pastoral, that method of operation doesn't really work, because all you have are fields, right? And you know, thousands of acres of it too. So we did what we did in Tantura. We started with historical images. And unlike Tantura, Dawayima has much fewer historical images. This is an image from a vaccination drive that the British had in Dawayima in 1921-22. Where they're sitting with the Mukhtar and his brother. Here, people were living also in caves and in tunnels, many of whom were hiding also from the British when they came to vaccinate them, where they gathered people. These kind of Orientalist images, right, as much as they might nauseate us, they also provide us with a sense of texture of the village, to understand the kinds of stones, architecture that the village had. It allowed us to model the village in 3D as much as we could, because, and here also is the hospital, because unlike Tantura, Dawayima was flattened almost in full very quickly after it was occupied. So we didn't have a lot of visual evidence to work with. And when you don't have visual evidence, of course, you rely much more on the testimonial, which is exactly what we did. Testimonial both by talking to people. We traveled to Amman and we interviewed survivors of a major massacre that occurred at a cave called Tur al-Zaq. Took us some time to understand that Rasm al-Zaq and Iraq al-Zaq and Tur al-Zaq are actually the same, that people are referring to the cave in relation to the rivers or in relation to the well or in relation to the hill, but it's the same site, it's the same massacre, they're not multiple massacres. So in many ways, what we did in Gaza in 2014, we had to do again, cross-referencing the data to understand it's actually the same incident that everybody's speaking of. And in talking to people, and in particular here, in engaging with their memory maps again. we were able to locate what we believe are possible sites of Tur al-Zaq in an area where all you have are caves and kilns. So these are two memory maps of the hundreds of memory maps that Muhammad al-Khudr, Abu Yasser has made. He's a cartographer. I call him a cartographer. He denies it. He's a researcher, originally from Dawayima, and he has spent decades talking to people and making memory maps. I mean, being in his studio is a dream for anyone who's nerdy about cartography. But he started in a very similar way as we do testimony, right? He starts from the individual. What's your name? Where's your home? Who's your neighbor? And from there, he draws a map. And sometimes the maps are maybe a little bit more elemental, right? Less developed, more sketches, you can say. Other times, they look almost like veins, right? Of a family vein, where every family is marked. And very importantly, on these maps, you see indicators of where massacres occurred. So he put symbols based on what people said of where massacres occurred. Now, these are not things that we can easily superimpose on satellite images, right? So we had to use markers of starting from the main square, starting from the village mosque, starting from the threshing floor where the Friday souk was held. And through that, we were able to piece together the village on a satellite image. You have all of the I would say most of the main markers that were available to us from the memory maps that we were able to mark. And by talking to people, we were able to delimit the area of where a particular massacre occurred at the cave of Tur al-Zaq. People would tell us it occurred between Khirbet Hazana and al-Mais. It was in Dawayima lands along the border. We went up X many meters, went down X many meters. We crossed two valleys, right? When you measure the topography and you quantify it and use that as your marker, you're able to increasingly delimit the areas that you were, that is of interest. Importantly, people also told us, survivors told us, that there was a kiln nearby where those who were killed, who were executed en masse, were buried later by survivors who came back. So that helped us a lot because we knew the visual signatures of what a kiln looked like from the 1945 aerial images. And so we marked all the kilns that we saw in our areas. We did a 200-meter radius around it. Based on the radius and the direction that the survivors went, we were able to delimit it to 3 main kilns, around which we found 3, or actually 4, I would say, 4 caves. We then looked at those sites from the aerial images to see where they matched. And very importantly, people told us that from the cave, you could see the house of the Mukhtar. So this is where the 3D model comes in. That was really relevant because we then did various reconstructions of the views from the 4 potential sites of Tur al-Zaq, from the 4 potential sites of the cave. We asked ourselves, well, from which site can you see the house of the Mukhtar as it was modeled? And finally, one very important additional piece of evidence that we found was an article from 1984 in an Israeli newspaper called Hadashot, where the former Mukhtar of the village was interviewed and took the journalist to the site of Dawayima, of where he said Tur al-Zaq was. And we geolocated that on top of from the perspective of where the hills were and what we were seeing, on top of our 3D model. And in doing so, once we photo matched it within our model, the image only corresponded to one of the kilns from its positionality, which meant that this kiln, K1, as we call it, is most likely the site where the bodies of those who were massacred were buried, and that each of its 3 caves could be the site of Tur al-Zaq. In our interviews, we use a variety of techniques. We use clays, where with Abu Bassam, who's one of the survivors, he was 10 years old at the time and his entire family was massacred. He was the only survivor of the Tur al-Zaq massacre. Still remembers, I mean, the memory of this generation is nothing like ours, remembering all of the steps of their homes, etc. But he helped us model the cave itself. And with his sketches, we were able to do a 3D reconstruction of Tur al-Zaq, of the cave, and also to understand how many people could fit within the cave, so that that also corresponds with the testimony of the witnesses. And it did. Between 80 to 100 people could fit within what we see as the size of the cave and what Abu Bassam was telling us. We measured the kilns, as we said, the cave, sorry, as we said also, and located them on present day, on the land in the present, which is on which an Israeli settlement stands. Now, the reason I share this is, of course, you can go to Dawayima today, what remains of the village of Dawayima. You see the presence of these caves that are still there, that are protected. But the reason I share this is because, one, to give you a sense of the way that we piece together events. But two is that, and as I said, this project has felt much more urgent since this iteration of the genocide in Gaza. And what we realized quickly was that all of the holes that we come across in a village like Dawayima that's flattened after it's occupied, there's very little visual evidence. So how did the army do this? Or did they separate the men and women? Once they did, how did they do that? Those holes are filled in by what we're seeing today. Right? So whereas today we have the images that show us how they separate and how they massacre, that aligns very much with the testimonies of what we saw in 1948 happening. That evidence, the evidence from today, helped us when looking back at the massacres in 48, and particularly in these two, in the last case that you're going to look at. So far from seeing these cases as a vacuum, there is historical continuity that becomes all the more apparent with the extension of this genocide into the West Bank and into parts of Lebanon, as we see, and along with their destructive practices. This is the closest that our colleague on the ground got to the village of Dawayima. The other parts of it were behind the walls or the fences of the Israeli settlement. But what's interesting is that Tur al-Zaq, the site that we were interested in, was named after the Zaq bird, the crow or the jackbird. And when you go there, you still see the jackbird in the area. So while the people are not there, displaced and waiting for their rightful return, what's clear from these projects is that the land still remembers and still continues to host the bodies and the bones of those it has lost. And these two cases, along with the other cases that we hope to take on, is part of building that archive, an archive that we are now also starting to build in Gaza. I'll stop there. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm happy to answer the question.
مواقع المجازر بتألم الواحد لما يا أخي بتألم لأنه مش صح. ولأنه أنا دارس التاريخ بقول كل هذا بتكرر.
مجزرة بمعنى الكلمة. فالناس كلها وقعت على بعضها كوم واحد، كان كله دم. بعد ما راحوا المكان اللي اجوا منه ظليت اطلع عليهم انا بعيني هذول وانا حاطط ايدي هيك، وانا بطلع بعيني اختفوا. وين رجعوا؟ على البلد الدوائم.
With around 4,000 inhabitants, the Palestinian village of al-Dawayima was one of the largest villages in the Al-Khalil district. On the 29th of October 1948, al-Dawayima was invaded by the Israeli Army's 89th Battalion. With no armed forces, the village was ethnically cleansed in full on that day. Witnesses spoke of a series of massacres followed by rape, looting, starvation, and the systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure. Ten days after the invasion, Belgian and French observers were taken to al-Dawayima by the Israeli liaison officers. They write in their report, "I noticed about 15 places where houses were still smoking after having been burnt. There were quite a few that gave a peculiar smell, as if bones were burning." The atrocities conducted by Israeli forces in al-Dawayima have today been well documented, but the location of its major massacre, a cave called Shourideh, remains unknown. Forensic architecture worked with the Palestine Land Society and the al-Dawayima Cultural Association in order to locate the likely site for the first time. Using written and oral testimonies, we retraced the erased village and built a 3D model that would function as a memory aid for survivors. We conducted situated testimonies with Palestinian witnesses and used clay to help reconstruct the cave.
تصوري انت احنا دخلنا مع اطفال مع نسوان حوالي 80.
Key to our investigation were ground level and aerial photographs,
فهم شافونا من عند المنطقة هاي.
as well as multiple memory maps produced by a researcher from al-Dawayima, Muhammad Rajab Abu Khadra, known as Abu Yasser. In this way, we have located for the first time the possible sites of a major massacre conducted by Israeli forces in al-Dawayima, a cave called Shourideh. Abu Yasser spent over 2 decades meeting with dozens of survivors of the massacres, creating and collecting numerous memory maps of the village.
أولاً أنا مش متخصص في رسم الخرائط، هذه واحدة. مش متخصص، أنا مدون يعني، لكن عندي إصرار.
We asked him about his methods.
أقول له أنت شو اسمك؟ يقول لي اسمي. ليه؟ 1 2 3 4 5. هذا ببين عمود النسب تبعه. تقول له وين داركو؟ مين منكم شمال؟ مين منكم شرق؟ مين منكم غرب؟ مين منكم جنوب؟ هو يقول لي بيتنا هان، فأنا أسجل وين بيتهم، أحطه على الخارطة.
Comparing Abu Yasser's multiple memory maps with 1945 aerial photographs from the British Mandate allowed us to piece together the social and physical fabric of al-Dawayima, identifying main village roads, main wells, the area of the school, main village square, the area of the Salama shrine, the main mosque, the area of the mill, the threshing floor of Al-Jaroun, where the weekly Friday market took place, the house of the former Mukhtar, as well as the house of the new Mukhtar. Shadows in this aerial image allowed us to calculate the height of the village structures. And with these markers, we were able to locate the testimonies of Palestinian survivors within the village.
وفعلا احنا بتذكر يعني انه نمنا على سطوح فوق، لانه الطائرات كانت تلف حوالين البلد، طائرات اسرائيليه، وتاكدنا انه هذا كان يوم الخميس، تاكدنا انه يوم الجمعه راح يصير في احتلال.
Abu Bassam was 10 years old when Israeli forces attacked al-Dawayima, invading the village from 3 directions and carrying out a series of massacres.
هم كانوا في المسجد في الأصل، طلعوا على السوق. لما طلعوا على السوق لقوا السيارات، لقوا المصفحات، لقوا الجيش اليهودي، لقوا العصابات الصهيونية، لقوهم في هذا. وين رجعوا؟ رجعوا على الزاوية مشان تحميهم. في ناس منهم هانا انقتل، لأنه في ناس كانوا موجودين ما راحوش على الجامع، قتلوهم هان، حملوهم، وفي ناس أخذوهم طيبين ودبوهم في البير، بير العد.
Around a week after the depopulation of the village, an Israeli soldier named Kaplan, who participated in the massacres, wrote, "There was no battle and no resistance. The first soldiers to enter the village killed from 80 to 100 Arabs, men, women, and children. They killed the children by smashing their skulls with sticks. There was not a home without its dead. Arab men and women who remained in the village were shut into houses without food or water. One soldier boasted that he had raped an Arab woman and then shot her. The fewer Arabs that will remain, the better." Fearing for their lives, Abu Bassam, together with 3 generations of his family, fled their home, seeking shelter in a nearby mountain called Qanan Abid.
يعني ابوي كان حامل على كتفه، يعني حامل طحين، وامي حامله اكل، وانا حامل لي شويه ملابس، على بقيت انا 10، واختي حامله، هذول اللي كنا حاملينه. كان هدفنا انه بس نبعد شويه يوم او يومين، فكان احنا بدنا نقعد هون، لكن يوم ما شافونا صاروا يطلقوا علينا النار، طلعنا من هذا المنطقه وظلينا رايحين للمنطقه الشرقيه.
Abu Bassam and his family continued to flee in the direction of a cave called Tur al-Zagh, the site of one of the largest massacres in al-Dawayima, which has been lost to memory. We use the 3D model of the village as a mnemonic device to help survivors retrace their steps. Abu Bassam's testimony and sketch give us key indicators of the cave's position.
هذه طور الزرع جاي بين تلتين، تلة مش عالي، مش في جبل ولا هو في وادي.
He tells us that Tur al-Zagh lies in an east-west valley. It is located close to the border between al-Dawayima and Dura on al-Dawayima land. and lays between al-Mais to the northeast and Khirbat Hazana nearly parallel to the west.
خربة هزانة وخربة الميس تقريبا.
يعني تقريبا هيك.
These markers allow us to delimit the area to the southeast of the village. Understanding his trajectory starting from Qanaan Abid will narrow down the possible sites within this area.
ضلينا نمشي.
He describes going downhill, passing the house of the former Mukhtar,
بعدين طلعنا طلوع
and then slightly uphill.
يعني خفيف.
Abu Bassam also confirms the testimonies of other Palestinian witnesses that there was an old latoon, a pit or kiln, nearby Tur al-Zaq, where the bodies of those killed were taken after the massacre.
واللتون في جنب الطور، في جنب طور الزاغ. يعني فيش بقى 100 متر بس.
The kiln served as our key landmark. A British Mandate map from 1938 pinpoints the location of kilns in the surroundings of the village, which in turn allowed us to recognize their visual signature on the 1945 aerial image.
حفرة 4 متر في 4 متر هيك دائرية.
Within our delimited area, we located 8 kilns. We drew a 200-meter radius around each kiln using his and other testimonies, and within this range identified valleys where a cave may be located. Near kilns 1, 2, and 3, we found the likely visual signatures of 4 caves, 2 of which are located slightly outside of their 200-meter radius. Abu Bassam describes another key detail.
لو احنا في الطور كنا شايفين بيت المختار.
Using our 3D model, we were able to reconstruct the views from the caves and determine that the area of the house of the Mukhtar is visible from all 4 locations, rendering them all potential sites for the Tur al-Zaq cave. One additional piece of information allowed us to narrow down the potential sites. We obtained a 1984 photo of a kiln, which the new Mukhtar of al-Dawayima identified as the site where the bodies were buried. When photo matched, this image only corresponds to the location of Kiln 1. This suggests 2 things: that Kiln 1 is more likely the site where the bodies were buried, and that therefore one of these 3 caves is the more likely site of the massacre of Tur al-Zaq.
احنا وصلنا يعني العصر تقريبا. وصلنا انا وابوي هناك.
Once they arrived at Tur al-Zaq, Abu Bassam's family and the other villagers were spotted by Israeli soldiers from a distance.
للأسف كان الغلط انه نزلنا كنا في المغارة. تصوري انت احنا دخلنا مع اطفال مع نسوان حوالي 80 كنا في المغارة كلها.
Using his childhood memories of the cave, we modeled Tur al-Zaq. Abu Bassam describes the cave that has a 5-meter diameter opening, a 10-meter diameter base, a 3-meter height, and an entrance with 4 to 5 steps leading downward. Our model confirms that the cave's dimensions as described by Abu Bassam could hold this number of people. We also compared these specifications to our 3 potential caves. Both Cave A and B match these dimensions. In the visual signature of Cave B, this elongated shape could indicate the presence of an entrance connected to the cave, making it a more likely site of the massacre. Another witness we interviewed, Nasser, was around 3 years old at the time.
يعني هالقد قراب. شوف انت شايفة كيف
لا كثير هذا بعيد.
هذا كتير. اقلل شوي هيك.
زي هالعيلة اللي تبقى متجمعة وقاعدة في بيتها العيلة، بس إنه في زيادة عليها.
اوكي. انه قراب هالقد بيني وبينك.
هلا مختفين احنا عنهم، وهم يظلوا يرشوا علينا توصلونا. طوقوا المغارة جنود هيك، اطلع عربيم اطلع عربيم اطلع عربيم، طلعنا. شايفه؟ طلعنا كلنا حوالي 80-90 نفر، طبعا أولاد بنات ورجال ونسوان. الغالبية يعني نسوان وأولاد صغار، يعني كلهم معظمهم عائلات. يعني طلعنا كلنا برا، نزلونا لعند الدبابات تبعتهم 2، ظلينا برا احنا وياهم يعني يمكن في نص ساعة. فتشوا الرجال والناس صارت هيك من الخوف، سووا جمهور جنب بعضهم يعني كلهم، أنا وأولادي وبناتي وهذول يعني كل عيلة مع بعضهم، لكن كلهم كوم واحد صاروا. في لحظة بدوا يرشوا بدون حذور، بدون تحذير وبدون شيء، يعني مجزرة بمعنى الكلمة. تصوري أما يكونوا كلهم جمهور واحد وتطلق عليهم 10,000 طلقة و20,000 طلقة من هاي الأسلحة الأوتوماتيكية، فالناس كلها وقعت على بعضها كوم واحد.
أبوي حطيتني هيك في جنبها وحطت علي إلها غدفة زي هيك، لست علي وخبتني بين رجليها وطخوا هالناس قتلوها. قتلوهم ولا قبلوا في الختيار، حتى الختيار اللي على حفة قبره يقتلوه، يدبوهم في البيار ويقطعوا ايديهم خوفي هذا ويقتلوهم. الختيار يقتلوه، الصغير يقتلوه، الكبير يقتلوه، ما يخلوش يعني ما يفرقوش بين حدا، زي ما بيسووا في غزة قاعدين قتلوهم.
بعد ما راحوا المكان اللي اجوا منه ظليت اطلع عليهم انا بعيني هذول وانا حاط ايدي هيك، وانا بطلع بعيني اختفوا من عند بيت المختار. وين رجعوا؟ على البلد. رجعوا على البلد، انا شفتهم راحوا، قمت كان كله دم. شايفه؟ رحت شفت أبوي لأنه كان في الأول، لقيته كله متوفي، طلقاته في راسه كله الله يرحمه. رجعت أدور على أمي، برضه كانت معها طفل عمره 8 شهور صغير، وأجت طلقاتها في صدرها وعلى راس الولد. الولد يعني لحد الآن منظره مش رايح يروح من قدامي، راسه هيك مفتوح، طفل عمره 8 شهور. وأمي كل طلقاتها في صدرها في رقبتها، وتوفت رأسا. غطيتها بالرداء اللي على راسها ووقفت.
Accounts by survivors of the number of those killed at Tourizar vary between 80 to over 100, including men, women, and children. Abu Bassam was eventually carried by another survivor for an hour to the nearby village of al-Mais. Nasser was also taken there with her family.
بعدين بيجيك طريق ترابية بتودي على الميس وعلى خربدور على بيت عوة وعلى.
For each of the likely sites of Tur az-Zagh, there are possible paths to al-Mais.
المذبحة اسمها طور الزاغ، والدفن الله يرحمهم جميعا صارت في اللتون اللي هم كان قريب من الجثث. حملوهم كلهم، نزل بيطلع 100 واحد من الدوائم كلهم، يعني تعاونوا مع بعضهم ونقلوا يحملوا يدبوا في الجورة هذه في اللتون. بعدين اجوا دفنوهم كلهم، غطوهم في التراب في نفس الليلة. يعني الجمعة السبت كانوا مدفونين في اللتون.
After its depopulation, the village was systematically looted and its cultural heritage destroyed.
واحد بقول عسكري احنا اجينا وموسى ديان على الزاويه هذه وقلنا انا بدي الهلال اللي فوقيها بكره الصبح على مكتبي، فما قدرناش نطلع، نسفنا المسجد كله بس بده الهلال.
Archival photos from 1955 show the inauguration of the Jewish settlement of Amatzia being built on the lands of al-Dawayima. In these images, we can identify what remains of the original village. Al-Zawiya Mosque is one of the last standing landmarks of al-Dawayima. Aerial images from 1956 and 1958 further document that the village was fully flattened to make way for the new settlement, beginning with fortifications and temporary structures visible in the southern part of the village. By 1965, these structures were replaced by more permanent ones designed for settlement expansion. And by 1969, the land was scraped and scarred once more. Aerial images from 1970 to the present show the evolution of the settlement. Today, the likely sites of where we believe Tur az-Zagh stands are under the Israeli settlement Bnei Dekalin, as is the possible kiln where the remains of the bodies of those massacred lay. Caves A and B have disappeared beneath land that appears to be planned for Israeli settler construction. Cave D is visible in the aerial image. Meanwhile, Kiln 1, the possible location of where the bodies of those massacred lay, has also disappeared, likely due to overgrown vegetation. All that remains of al-Dawayima today is the shrine of Sheikh Ali outside of the village, along with traces of the walls of original Palestinian agricultural plots and the ruins of their homes.
فهذا احنا بنسوي هذا حتى تبقى عملية متواصلة مع الأجيال القادمة وحتى يكون لهم أمل في حق العودة. المهم إني أنا أوصل وأترك بصمة للأجيال القادمة. وقفت برسم الزاغ حيرانا علي أنادي بطور الزاغ إنسانا أرسلت صوتي للأوطان أسمعه إلى الوريد الذي بالأمس قد كان. في الآخر بقول أنا قد يشعل النار في أطراف مهجعه ويشعر القوم بأن الثأر قد حان.
وقفت برسم الزاغ حيرانا، علي أنادي بطور الزاغ إنسانا. أرسلت صوتي للأوطان أسمعه، إلى الوليد الذي بالأمس قد كان. قد يشعل النار في أطراف مرجعه، ويشعر القوم بأن الثأر قد حان. وقفت برسم الزاغ حيرانا، علي أنادي بطور الزاغ إنسانا. أرسلت صوتي للأوطان أسمعه، إلى الوليد الذي بالأمس قد كان. قد يشعل النار في أطراف مهجعه، ويشعر القوم بأن الثأر قد حان. قد يشعل النار في أطراف مهجعه، ويشعر القوم بأن الثأر قد حان. قد يشعل النار في أطراف مهجعه، ويشعر القوم بأن الثأر قد حان. قد يشعل النار في أطراف مهجعه، ويشعر القوم بأن الثأر قد حان. قد يشعل النار في أطراف مهجعه، ويشعر القوم بأن الثأر قد حان.
Take a brief 1 to 2 minute break before going on to the next screening. Thank you very much, everyone. If you could take your seats, please. We're about to begin the second film screening.
على جانب البيت.
على جنب البيت.
وهاي عنا بهلا بيتين كبار هون.
هم بيتين، واحد لأحمد وواحد لأبوي.
وهون البحر.
وهون البحر. أكيد هذا
ليش تتذكر؟
هذا البيت.
هذا بيتك؟
أكيد.
هذا بيتك؟
إيه. أقعد أنا وأبوي على البحر لما يكون رمضان، ونقعد نشوف البحر لما الشمس تغيب.
The Palestinian fishing village of Tantura, with around 1,500 inhabitants, was one of the last remaining Arab communities along the coast when the State of Israel was established on the 15th of May, 1948. By the 23rd of May, Tantura was occupied and depopulated by Israeli forces.
عاد احنا نايمين ما سمعنا الا ضرب رصاص بلش رصاص يمين وشمال.
Witnesses spoke of fierce Palestinian resistance and systematic Israeli massacres after the occupation of the village. By analyzing ground-level photographs, memory sketches drawn by refugees, village surveys, and aerial images, and by listening to the testimonies of Palestinian witnesses, we located sites of mass graves previously unidentified. Using an immersive 3D model of the village, we further undertook situated testimony with Adnan Yahya, a survivor of the massacre.
اليوم الاحتلال، اوكي خلينا نحكي اليوم الاحتلال.
بشمال، هذا بشمال البلد وفي شرق البلد، واجوا اليهود من البحر كمان. فالمقاومين ما عندهم سلاح كويس، كان ضعيف. قتلوا حوالي 20 25 واحد قتلوا.
British mandate aerial images from 1946 and 1947 show Tantura before its invasion and the subsequent ethnic cleansing as a living village. Vegetation is tended and roads regularly used. Israeli aerial images from 1949 show concentrated destruction in 3 prominent areas. In the north of the village near the main cemetery, along by the beach, and in the southern part of the village. These scars correspond to military maps and testimonies regarding the directions of the Israeli invasion. Aerial images from 1952 further document the village being gradually hollowed out following its forced depopulation, and the Jewish settlements of Nakhshulim and Dor being built on its lands. By 1956, the village was almost fully demolished.
عفوا قبل ما نروح لهناك حطونا على شط البحر، جمعونا رجال على شط البحر بالشمس، جمعونا كمية كبيرة وقعدنا بالشمس، لا أكل ولا شرب ولا مي ولا شيء أبدا، ولا شيء. بعدين أخذوا كلياتنا على المقبرة.
The systematic gathering and separation of men and women and children is often the first step of mass executions. Multiple archival images show Israeli forces separating villagers in Tantura.
صفوف كصفوف المصلين الرجال، واخذ النساء حطوهن في مكان ثاني.
Women and children were gathered by Israeli forces and placed on trucks and forced out of the village. Many were displaced to the nearby village of Shourideh, later pushed out of Palestine and rendered refugees. According to the testimonies of survivors, a series of executions of disarmed fighters and civilians were conducted by Israeli forces. Accounts of the numbers of those murdered vary greatly between 20 and 280, mainly men, with testimonies suggesting that women were also amongst the victims.
ياخذوا زينة الشباب وحطوها على الحيط ورشوها. وهاي شوف أعيان، نعم، شاهد أعيان، نعم.
ياخذوهم على مسافة 20 متر هيك بالدخلات تبع الحارة، يديروا على الحيط يرشوهم. باثناء ساعة زمان، ساعتين زمان، قتلوا بيطلع 60 70 شاب.
وقتها يعني حملونا، نقلونا من البحر إلى منطقة قرب المقبرة. عرفت كيف؟ في هناك صبر.
منه لكبلة ولا مغرب، هذا كلها تكبور. هاي من حد ولا كبلة لحد النخلات، هذا مقبرة. للشجرات ولا شمال بكن 3 شجرات، منها ولا شمال حوالي 30 متر هناك، يعني أقل أكثر ما بقى.
The aerial image from 1949 shows a large human-made rectangular mound that didn't exist in previous images. Using shadow analysis, we modeled this earthwork. It is 33 meters long, 3 meters wide, and approximately 1 meter high. Depending on how the bodies were buried, the size of the grave could contain between 60 and 160 bodies. North of the mound is a shallow rectangular patch with a very minor depth. This patch has semi-regular edges and a lighter earth color than its surroundings. This lighter color could be attributed to a scar of the bulldozer scraping the surface north of the mound, potentially to pile more earth over the original grave. We also observed a short road that leads to a small building with a domed roof, likely added by the Israeli army. This earth mound is visible in the aerial image from 1952. By 1956, it was overgrown by vegetation, and by 1957, the mound was flattened. The only trace is the scar of the bulldozer scraping the ground. It is possible that some human remains are spread across the area leveled for a parking lot.
والله كانوا يقولوا شي 60 70 واحد، بين ولد وبين بنت وبين زلمه. يدفنوا كل مع بعض، يدفنوا بجورة واحدة. الجورة هاي بيقولوا لها بستان السوقي.
A memory sketch of the village, drawn by Tantura survivor Ahmad Taha Salam, identifies the properties of different families prior to the occupation of the village. We geolocated the family properties in the 1947 aerial image using key markers such as main roads, the village square, and the mosque. Of these, Plot 6 contains an orchard and the largest field owned by the Dasuqi family in 1948. When overlaying the 1947 aerial image with the 1949 image, a human-made earth mound is visible in this field. Importantly, the second mound is similar in form and dimensions to the one we saw near the cemetery. Both are long and thin earth features of a similar width and height, oriented along a similar east-west axis, and are parallel to a line of high vegetation in an otherwise open field. It is our assessment that this is very likely a second mass grave with a dimension that could contain between 40 to 80 bodies.
حفروا هالجورة صاروا زي السردين على سكينه على جنبه، يصفطوا بيهم. حطوا أول صف وثاني صف، ضلوا 3 نسوان برا، في 3 نسوان. حفروا لهم كمان جورة الثلاثة ودفنوهن. وين دفنوهن؟ دفنوهن في بستان الدسوقي.
Traces of this mass grave are visible in the 1952 aerial image. The location of this mass grave was previously unidentified. Multiple testimonies refer to executions and burial behind Ahmed Haj Yahya's house by the beach. In an interview, Tantura survivor Mustafa al-Masri pointed to the southern part of a 2-meter wall behind the home of Haj Yahya.
الإسلام والنسوان والكل اللي الإسلام بقت كلها تعطوهم مع الشباب، وبعدين بقى اللي بدهم إياه كانوا تعال ياخذوا يكتفوا وياخذوا بعد 5 دقائق تسمع حس إطلاق طلع.
Fuad Hassadiyeh, resident of Fredis, recounted finding human bones in the same area.
מתחתיי, הון, פה. אז אני, בתוך כדי עבודה ראיתי הרבה עצמות, מלא עצמות. אני שואל אותו, מה זה העצמות האלה? מה זה העצמות האלה? כאילו, נכנסתי לשוק.
A large ground disturbance is visible approximately 25 meters south of the site. We believe this is possibly the site of a mass grave testified to by survivors.
داخل في المقبره، في داخل القبور، بين القبور. يعني ما اهتموا ايش اي محل، انما كان داخل المقبره بين القبور العاديه. جيبين الحفره،
يعني زي هذا الكولة
المقبره ولا الحفره؟
ولا
الحفره.
الحفرة.
الحفره 2 متر، 1.5 متر تقريبا، أكثر من 3 أمتار عميقة كانت، عشان تاخذ أكثر كمية ممكن من الناس. إيه
2.5 متر.
إيه، وكنا واقفين إحنا على الطرف، على الجنب. هاي صعب أتذكرها هذا بس
Like Adnan, multiple other witness testimonies also speak of the existence of further mass graves inside the cemetery.
يمسكوا يعبوا قتلة ويجيبوا ويديروا هيك على التربة، والله وعيني تتفرج. ايه والله، ايه بنص التربة يحطوها.
In the aerial image from 1949, we observed ground disturbances corresponding to the location and dimensions of the mass grave described in these testimonies. it is possible that one or more of these scars are remnants of those graves.
صديقي ابن مدرستي
نعم.
كنت انا وياه سوا في المدرسه عبد الله اسمه كنت نحمل هذا ونرميهم. فالشيء اللي ما بنساه في حياتي حملنا واحد من ايديه واجريه، هو حمل اجريه وانا حملت ايديه، بتطلع فيي بيقول لي عدنان هذا ابوي. That's my father.
نعم.
And he is still living. What shall I do? قلت له through him. فرميناه وهو طيب ما ميت بعده مجروح. هذا شيء ما بنساه في حياتي ابدا. I don't forget that at all.
Over the past 75 years, the stones from Tantura have been used in the construction and landscaping of the 2 Jewish settlements and tourist resorts that were built over its ruins. Only 3 original buildings from the village of Tantura remain, along the traces of original roads and trees. The mass grave by the cemetery is today a parking lot serving the tourist resort. The mass grave by the Dasuqi field is the beginning of a pedestrian promenade leading out of the parking lot. The sites of the graves testified to by witnesses are located within the holiday camps. The mass graves in Tantura have since been desecrated, but the testimony of the land stands alongside the memory of its survivors.
هلا انا شايف نفسي، انا شايف نفسي شو عم بساوي. يعني كيف؟ مع انه it is like a dream, like a dream, a very bad dream.
So much. Thank you so much for sticking around with us, everyone. I'm just going to give a brief closing remarks because our Q&A and discussion will not be live streamed. It will only be available to those of us who are here in person. So I'll just say thank you so much to all of those who are live streaming and watching us on Zoom. For the past 15 months, we've been watching in real time as new Tanturas, Dawaimas, Deir Yassins, Balad al-Sheikhs, Lidiyas, and Sa'sa massacres unfold before our very eyes during the ongoing genocide in Gaza, a second Nakba. Yet unlike the horrific massacres that have ethnically cleansed the native Palestinian people from their land, for the very first time in modern Palestinian history, the indigenous population in Gaza have managed to resist a global onslaught against them, successfully returning to their homes in the north of a besieged strip that refused to be erased from the map. As Radwa Ashur reminds us in her novel, The Woman in Tantura, quote, "War may destroy cities, but it cannot extinguish people, the spirit of the people." One day, as our valiant people are defiantly doing so in Jabalia, Beit Hanun, Beit Lahia, Rimal, and Attatra, one day the rest of our people will return to the 520 plus villages that they were violently expelled from between 1947 and 1949. Before I close and we go into Q&A for those of us who are here today, I just wanted to thank my backbone here at the Jerusalem Fund, my Deputy Director, Duna Dabbas, who's in the back room. There's a lot of people, so please save your claps till the end. My office and finance manager, Tariq Nasser, my incredible interns, Laith, Ella, Lucas, Dania, as well as the IPS team, Laura, and the rest of the fantastic group over there. So with that, I'll have a secondary closing remarks for the end. But thank you for all of those who joined us online. We're going to now move to Q&A. Yeah.